So, Leslie, it's so wonderful to have you here with us today, reading for the South Florida Poetry Journal and answering some of our questions. And I just want to jump right in and start out with asking you to talk a little bit about the title of your book. I've been reading some reviews, and people seem to have focused on the fact that it's a line from Old Man and the Sea by
Mhm.
Hemingway, and that there's a sense of lack, a sense of hunger in the
Mhm.
title. But I also think that knowing the story of Old Man and the Sea, it also feels like there's two things at once. And one of them is also eating something that could lead to um, the demise of
Mm.
the person, or there's a little bit more danger in that line than I think I've heard mentioned before. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And let me just start by saying I'm so excited to be here and to be in conversation with you, Judy, and the South Florida Poetry Journal. Yeah, so I reread Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea in graduate school, actually at the encouragement of my father. Um, and admittedly, I'm not a big fan of Hemingway as a prose stylist. I find syntactically his work to be a little stilted. Um, but when I came across the passage that the title is lifted from, um, I just felt very changed by it. There was sort of a somatic electricity feeling that came over me. Um, and if it's helpful, I'm happy to just kind of read what that excerpt is and talk a little bit about
Sure.
how I see that functioning in relation to my work. But the passage from The Old Man and the Sea that this is taken from reads, "Eat it so that the point of the hook goes into your heart and kills you," he thought. "Come up easy and let me put the harpoon into you. All right, are you ready? Have you been long enough at table?" And so I think you're absolutely spot on. I think it's not just the sense of lack, the sort of hesitant questioning, the need for a sense of reassurance, and naturally too, the question sort of inherently creating a situation of relation, right? Where one person is speaking to another person. And I think this book, I often describe it as being a book fundamentally about codependency, codependency between uh, family members, seeing that operate within a family system, but also codependency between nations. And so that sort of relational aspect that's inherent in that question feels very important to me. And I also think what you said about danger, in my experience of codependency and in my speaker's experience of it in the collection, feels very much marked by danger. There's a sort of toxicity inherent in that relational dynamic, this sort of um, the dangers of sort of being in relation to a narcissist or someone who is quite demanding of another person, to the extent that there's a process of enmeshment and it's difficult to see the boundaries around either person. Um, and then I think, as you said, thinking about food, which I think is a really important cultural touchstone for this collection. Um, the asking someone if they've eaten enough, I think is it can be a gesture of care, but I think depending on what the answer is, there is a kind of danger on the other side of that. And I think there may be some more subtle references throughout the book around having complicated relationships with food. And so when I came across this line, it just sort of felt like it encompassed all of the many different threads and branches that I see as sort of humming throughout the collection.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. I wonder if you would read to us the first poem in the book, Nyo, on page 1, and just give us a taste of your poetry to begin with.
Yeah, I love reading this poem, so I'm so glad you asked. Ño, para los balseros. There is no country where the dead don't float. Men and children going, having gone, lung wet across thickened water. Be it the body to know what's missing, to call back the colors. At sea, the stomach is a bugle, though I've heard it called a scream. Oil drums, headless as monarchs, styrofoam on the knees, said of regimes, under or over, here or there. The orchids are lovely this time of year, and the women writing. What covers the land, and is the land, much in us still.
Thank you. It's a beautiful poem and a great introduction to the rest of your collection. It introduces all the major topics, I think, that you're working with in all of the other poems. One of the interviews I read, or actually it was a review, I think, by Christopher Spade, said that one of the challenges you had in writing this was that the family background, the history, the ocean-wide diaspora from Cuba, many very celebrated writers have written about this, and he kind of thought that maybe the challenge was those writers were speaking for you, speaking over you, and how do you approach a topic that's been written about by so many wonderful writers? And I don't know if that was a challenge for you or not. It seems like if it was, you certainly met it in this collection.
Thank you.
You're saying things that others haven't said before from a perspective that's new. So I wondered if you would just talk a little bit about your personal perspective on this topic and how it impacts you.
Yeah, that's a great question. To be honest, I think I benefited from a certain ignorance, I think, around the canon of literature that exists already around Cuban history or Cuba-US relations. And I think part of that is I kind of knew going into this project that I was less interested in seeking out existing literature that was written by people who are not Cuban or Cuban American, which there is absolutely a trove of, and which isn't to say that that isn't, well researched and scholarly, important literature, but for me, the personal connections to these stories and the ways in which it's impacted my family and my own upbringing and the way I move through the world, I knew that there was a certain nuance to that that I could contribute to that existing canon. And so I think what I attempted to seek out, I think in over the 8 years that it took to write this collection, was more specifically poetry collections written by contemporary Cuban and Cuban American women. And that sort of gendered angle was especially important to me, in that as I tried to seek out Cuban American poetry more generally, I was familiar with the work of Richard Blanco and Virgil Suarez. But I think even as I, in my own study and trying to ask, professors and teachers for recommendations, no one was ever really able to produce a collection by a contemporary Cuban American woman poet, which isn't to say that it doesn't exist. I have my own really treasured list of writers that contain those social identities and are writing in the current moment. But I just don't think their work is celebrated enough. And so it did feel as though there were sort of big shoes to fill, in the sense that I think the project, it felt ambitious, but I don't know that I felt necessarily that I was writing against other perspectives so much as I was most interested in capturing a sense of nuance that I think is often left out of conversations around Cuba-US relations. And I think the unique immigration narrative that Cubans and Cuban Americans hold and experience.
Great. Thank you. The poem Glassware seems to be interesting, not only in that it's in the 6 parts, it addresses family, it addresses everything. the revolution. I wondered if you would read that for us so we can get a sense of your longer poem.
Yeah. See, you're picking all of my favorites to read, which is
Great.
wonderful. Thank you. Okay. Glassware. 1. Overhearing an argument, something beneath my cheeks like heat, like cowbells. I am at my most probable, most liquid suddenly. I come when called. 2. Over dinner, a man, melting, sells American pillows through the television. The napkins are of a thick paper. The dishware, all rounded, the color of most bandages. I am impressed by my convincing father and loyal mother. Their face veins make clear they are not lying to themselves, not themselves. Faithfully, I am a large shard made of their smaller shards. If you were to turn my ears inside out, hot skin, sleep, only trust your family. 3. My father used to blow glass in California, sell plated jewelry from a dark gray suitcase, have regrets. My mother worked for Eastern Airlines and ate very little. Now, my mother lives alone and with my father in Miami. My father lives with my mother and some days himself. 4. When I am hurt, my sorry skull vibrates, needs sleep. I was barefoot when glass appeared on the floor. This time, most times, rage to keep it company. When no one apologizes, my eyes roll out of my head as packets of fake sugar. 5. Shortly after the revolution, children, students, worked the sugarcane fields. I hear this because it is told to me in the kitchen by my hurt parents. In 1964, a 12-year-old boy named Arnaldo Carrillo was said to have cut 7,608 pounds of cane a day. Fidel holds still the record, 9,230 pounds. 6. Sugar appears in many American fantasies. The convincing 60s sugar glass made to simulate broken windows and windshields, I will never taste it. It doesn't harm the actor, it harms the actor, argues the internet. Transparent, brittle sugar. When I study the 60s, other time periods, my eyes turn red like from cameras, or rum, or furnaces, or sand.
Thank you. I could spend days trying to unpack that poem and write a dissertation on it. It's a great poem. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot.
You have long poems, short poems, sonnets, prose poems, I think even a ghazal. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
you have, do you have find that the form chooses you and you decide to write a poem in a certain form, or
Mm.
does the poem begin to emerge and choose its own form? How does your process of writing happen?
Yeah. Um, I think for me, I am very interested in the relationship between content and form. I said earlier that I think of this book as being fundamentally about codependency. And I think I've started to understand my own generative process through that lens as well, which is to say, for me, I think content and form are in a codependent relationship. And I think content in my poetics is the one that's sort of driving the car. So depending on the subject matter, form will kind of follow suit. So for example, there are a couple poems in the collection in which they are physically taking place in sort of a tight space. So in Notice to Appear, the family is hiding in a closet. And so the form of that poem is rather narrow to sort of mirror that kind of claustrophobia. And then there's a poem later on in the collection called Self-Determination Theory, which takes place kind of in the living room of the home, but also you see a glimpse into the kitchen space. But it's more a sort of narrowing connection between the family. It's a tightness of emotion, of intensity, of a sort of epiphany that's happening around the dynamic in the home and where trust can be placed. And so, yeah, I'm always kind of thinking of how I can create a sort of experience with form that is hyper aware of subject matter and also can sort of induce into a reader a very bodily reaction.
Wonderful. It's interesting you just mentioned self-determination theory, because that's the next poem I had planned to ask you to read.
Yeah.
And there's an sort of a thread throughout this book of the speaker um, making their way through all these challenges and all these restrictions and limits. And I won't say there's a redemption at the end, but there is definitely a move in a direction of being more self-determined and independent and contained in oneself. And so this, I think, fits right in, if you would read that.
Yeah, of course. And I promise, Judy, I'm not just saying this. You've selected 3 poems that I have consistently been reading on tour, which I'm currently still on. So this is wonderful. You're in my sweet spot.
Great, great.
Self-determination theory also has an epigraph that I'll read first from Gertrude Stein, which reads, "There is something in this native land business, and you cannot get away from it." Self-determination theory. I sit in the living room. In the living room, my mother chokes on something cold and sharp. I launch an investigation. She is wearing a blue cotton shirt. Her shoulders are showing. The television is hush. I conclude she is struggling with a unique idea, one she should keep. Just like that, sparks, reds, whites. It is the savior mother calls US. US places his arms around her abdomen and applies sudden upward pressure. She heaves. The volume of the Nut News channel rises, and the sound alerts my father in the kitchen. To enter the living room, my father must step over the bodies of other Spanish-speaking men. He does so with ease. I weep in the living room. In the living room, my father watches US grope my mother, and though he is a jealous man, he says nothing, because he, too, accepts no other touch.
Thank you. Thank you. As in this poem and in many of the poems, I detected a sort of surrealism at times that seems to be needed in order to explain something that is very complex and maybe even contradictory. And I wonder if you have been enamored with surrealism with other poets or writers, and if you feel like that has sort of made its way into your work as a useful tool in getting at some of these topics.
Yes, yeah, I think you're spot on there. I have always had an affinity for the French surrealists, and I think in visual art as well. Leonora Carrington, Salvador Dali. I mean, I just I'm really compelled by any kind of art presentation that makes you question reality. I think that's a healthy impulse to have, and to have a piece of art kind of move one into that kind of space of thinking about thinking, I think is a really profound gift to give someone in the form of something they've created. So yeah, I would absolutely say that that's been a source of inspiration for me for quite some time. And I really appreciated what you said about contradiction, because as I've spoken more about this work, and as I've learned more about what others seem to recognize in it, I would say that the poetics of this collection is a poetics of uncertainty, but also a poetics of contradiction. And surrealism and surrealist images and occasions felt to me as sort of the most authentic or stable way to present, especially in domestic spaces, the absurd, and spaces in which maybe safety was put into question, and in my own difficulty, not necessarily knowing how else to tackle a subject that is that personal or is that compromising. And I think the surreal can function as a stand-in for the sort of darker elements of our experiences that are almost too painful to capture more literally.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that in addition to the surrealism, there's also dipping back into some original spirituality from Cuba and of the Cuban people, and Santeria and other types of indigenous spirituality systems. And I think, to me, it suggested that part of the way through all of this might be found by looking back and developing some spiritual connections. And the poem that I like all of the poems that are addressed to the spiritual entities, but Sonnet for Ochun is the on page 73 is one that really spoke, and I wanted to ask if you would read that one.
Happily. Yeah, again, you're 4 for 4, Judy. This is eerie now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I love closing out my readings with Sonnet for Oshun. So it'll be interesting to see where we go next. Sonnet for Oshun. After my left arm, I washed my right, neck, décolletage, and navel. I ate ground meat with large crystals of imported salt. The women and men who would stroke my hair if I asked, I thought of them fondly, then sadly. At the flea market, what I touched with a fingernail was a copper lamp, a mundane painting of mountains, the cashier's hum. I bought nothing I didn't want. In the cul-de-sac, I found clouds on leashes, loose roosters. I thought thoughts ugly as clothespins. Reading a used book, I suspected I knew less about death than the last person who held it. I spat into a mirrored sink. I lost my slippers and face. To feel more like water, I drank it. Before bed, I walked my plank of uncertainties and plunged further into uncertainty. Am I capturing all of history in this gesture? I shouted into the future. In the wet air of the future, I could have, but never appeared. No one was sorry but me.
Thank you. One of my favorite lines in there is, I walked my plank of uncertainties. That's so amazing.
Thank you. And that might honestly be a thesis statement for the book.
Yeah. I want to go back a little bit earlier in the book and talk a little bit about, have you talk a little bit more about your childhood and in Miami and your experience there, and how has worked its way into your poetry.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that that this book took 8 years to write. It also took 5 versions of this manuscript. And I think that the poems about my childhood really came about in that final version. And I've always struggled to write about Miami, even though I was born and raised there. Much of my family is still there. And I visit relatively often to see my parents, and extended family. But I've always found it incredibly difficult to write about. And so I think what emerges instead is often sort of symbolic. There are certain textures of Miami that I find penetrate my work and can be found throughout it. I think the element of water is very central to this collection, and naturally is something that, it belongs to the Republic of Cuba, but very much also South Florida and Miami. and water in so many different presentations. You know, it's sweat, it's swimming pools, it's hurricane season, it's rain, it's the ocean, it's so many different things. And so I find that I'm pulling textures from my experience growing up in South Florida, but I don't know that I've ever written a Miami poem. And I remember in graduate school, actually, I had the pleasure of meeting with the poet Amy Nezhukumatatil,
Mhm.
who is just phenomenal. And maybe this, for those of you who know her work, it's probably unsurprising, but when she read a couple poems at a much earlier stage of this project, she had said, oh, you don't seem to write about environment. All of your poems are about people. And I tried my best, I think, to write to write poems after that prompt. And I don't know that I've ever really been able to nail it. And I think that's because so much of my understanding of where I come from is about the people, you know? And so when I try to end up writing about my childhood or growing up in Miami or even certain environmental landmarks, it really always goes back to the memories I have of being in relation to other people. And, you know, I often joke this is not a very happy collection. It's not a beach read by any
Right.
means, and I did struggle to come to terms with what aspects of my childhood felt um, important to kind of re-render within the context of the journey that the primary speaker goes on, I think, across this collection. And I think, as you've so thoughtfully pointed out earlier, that there is this kind of evolution, perhaps of politics, of identity, that sort of revolves across the book. And I've mentioned this maybe in a couple of other places, but I grew up in a Fox News household, like many first generation Cuban Americans. I grew up in a conservative household whose politics were very conservative. And I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to say that there was a sort of process of indoctrination that happened, but there is something that happens when 24/7 Fox News is on in your home and the family gathers in the living room. And so I think the aspects of my childhood that, again, I attempt to capture here are really seeds, I think, that are meant to sprout into what I've come to understand is the process of careful unlearning that unfolds as the book continues on.
Wonderful. There's two poems about Miami I was going to ask you to read, and the first one I think more is maybe something about the political, but also the personal about Miami. Will the last American to leave Miami please bring the flag? And I always start out with poetry books by scanning the list of titles of poems, and that was one that really caught me, and I couldn't wait to get to it as I was reading through the book. So if you would read that, I would love it.
Sure. Will the last American to leave Miami please bring the flag? Roaches on the ceiling, even they don't want to walk where we walk. Dead brain, twitch, begging for it. NPR says the city has rented refrigerated container trucks to store the overflow of bodies. The officer asks to see our legs in the air, a struggle. When something of mine breaks or we bruise from impact, that's God.
Thank you. Lots to think about in that poem.
Yes, yeah.
The other poem about Miami is Malecon, Miami. And the quotes that begin the poem are so interesting and then lead into the rest of the poem. And I'd love to hear that if you would.
Of course. So there are two epigraphs here, as Judy mentioned. The first is from the Daily Mail that reads, Cuban experts say Havana's boardwalk could be underwater by 2100. There's also one by The Guardian that reads, many of Miami Beach's landmarks, the world famous South Beach and the picturesque Art Deco hotels of Ocean Drive, will be lost within 3 decades. Malecón, Miami. So the ocean refused to stay a tourist. So God doesn't give with both hands. We are waiting in as little clothing as crabs, brown bags with liquor in our wet hands. Who could save the this in us? More than once, we swam around dying for a minute. A look to the heavens, spent, sound of a crash, a currency, a beating. We will miss what did not belong to us. Yes. In wake of our absence, we submit wallets of breath to the ocean floor.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The state of our planet and how that affects South Florida and Cuba and the other islands seems to be also a kind of theme that runs throughout, and it's the water theme and the theme of lack and overabundance at the same time, and I find that to be, it just adds another layer. Your poetry is many layered. There's so much going on, and as you said, much of it is not happy necessarily, but it's there's something so true in the complexity and the contradiction both. I wondered if you would read a final poem for us, and that's the final poem in the book Remedios, which is beautiful, and I would love to hear it in your voice.
Yes, absolutely. This one is dedicated to my paternal grandmother, who we called Mamacita. Remedios para Mamacita. When God was a boy, the dirt was dark red and the myths of women explicit. Just enough of the world had been distributed to know what was possible, what you couldn't have. Love hid in the kernels of handsome mamey fruit. We sorted through piles of black beans in case they lied about its whereabouts. We built ladders we were too tired to climb. We cried. Eventually, we cried so often we were forced to invent salvation. We'd fill the largest bucket we could find with the coldest water. We'd sit the crier down and crowd behind her. After several synchronized breaths, we'd lift the bucket and tip it downward. What was left no longer resembled crying, but we chanted, come back to us anyway.
Thank you so much, Leslie. This has been a wonderful opportunity to hear you talk about and read your wonderful poems, and I'm going to cherish this book for a long time now that I've visited it with you as well as on my own. So is there anything else you would like us to know or think about in the book, or?
I don't know. I think I'm resistant towards maybe coloring someone's interpretation of the work based off of my experience of it. But I have to say, Judy, this was such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. You're so perceptive and thoughtful, and the care in which you've taken with this collection means so much to me. So thank you for this opportunity and the honor of speaking with you.
Thank you.